Okay, well, why don't we start? I wanted to first thank Christian and Roman for actually asking for this in the first place, since they are applying for jobs this coming cycle and wanted a little bit of information and structure on it. And particularly thanks to Chris Theissen for having a whole bunch of resources to bring to bear on this. I'll speak for Chris and I that our intention here is to kind of present some of the sort of basic information about planning for post-PhD job applications. It's not complete, and we have some additional resources at the end of the slides. And of course, some of you may know your own resources. And incidentally, Astrobytes just released yesterday their first of two parts on applying for postdoc positions. So there's a bunch of new information coming out as we go. Chris, I don't know, do you want to throw in any preliminaries here?
I think I would just say, this is just based on our experiences. So there's lots of different ways. I see that Eric is here. Eric has been on both sides of this, what do you do after your PhD coin also. So he probably has a lot to offer when we get into a discussion, I imagine. Thanks for coming, Eric.
Yeah, thanks for coming, Eric. Okay, well, maybe we can start by just sharing what our paths are, what Chris and my path is. Chris, do you want to start and kind of explain, what happened after your PhD and where did you go from there?
Sure. So I finished my PhD here at UC San Diego, but I was a grad student at Boston University, and then after I got my PhD, I did a postdoc with Quinn Konopaki, and at the same time I applied for fellowships. So I usually apply for fellowships at the end of your last year, or I guess about a year before you plan on defending, so that you have a job after. And I was unsuccessful, but I also was geographically required to stay in San Diego, so that really minimized the job market for me. So when I didn't get fellowships, I started applying for regular jobs and postdocs that came up. So Quinn hired me as a postdoc for 1 year, and then I had some job offers from the previous time that I had applied for jobs, because the cycle can tend to be kind of long for industry positions. So I left for a year, but before I left, I also applied for fellowships. So a couple of years into me leaving academia, I found out I got fellowships. So then I had to make a decision whether I was coming back or if I was staying out. And I decided to come back because I love what I do. So that is why I'm here right now today, I would say. So I have been in and out of academia into industry like a couple of times before and after the PhD.
Thanks, Chris. And I'd say I followed what's, quote, a traditional academic path, or as we'll talk about, there's nothing traditional about it when you look at the numbers. I applied for postdocs, both funded soft money postdocs and fellowships in the year before I finished my PhD. I was fortunate enough to get a fellowship and did 2 postdoctoral positions before starting my first faculty position at MIT. So I would say I've been purely on the academic track, so perhaps less interesting. And Eric, do you want to, since you'll probably give some insight into different pathways from the PhD, do you want to talk a little bit about what your pathway has been?
I got my undergraduate degree in 1981, and then I worked in industry as an engineer for 20 years or so. And I came back to graduate school when I was older than most in 2003, and I got my PhD at UCSD there. But since my PhD, I've just taught and done independent research, and so I'm not sure how much I'm going to have to say that's relevant to most people today here.
Well, I think that is one of the paths from the PhD is an independent research position where you're not in either a faculty job or a industry job. Okay, well, thanks. So So we wanted to start by focusing most of our discussion on the sort of postdoc step, because when you look at the statistics on where folks go from their physics PhD, and this is some data that just came out recently from the American Institute of Physics Statistical Research Center, about half of folks who get their physics PhD go on to be a postdoc. So that's 50% of everyone follows that path. About 40% of folks land in a potentially permanent position, and that's kind of code for industry or government typically. There are other temporary positions, things like, if you're an adjunct instructor, for example, that would be considered a temporary position. And the unemployment rate for physics PhDs is not surprisingly very low. But the plurality of folks who come out with a PhD tend to go into a postdoc position. And this is how that is actually varied with time. And so this has not actually been, we're kind of on an upswing for the number of postdocs. Pretty recently, it's been down as low as 40%. But this kind of has a cyclic behavior based on the overall economy, the available of industry jobs, for example. So this is something that fluctuates over time. But again, generally, a large fraction of the folks that get a physics PhD tend to go on to postdoc positions. So we're going to start with our discussion on that particular path.
Yeah, so the first type of position we'll talk about is sort of the typical postdoc, where you apply to work with someone who already has money. And I put here 2 to 5 year research position. I think it depends a little bit on your field. Whether you're building an instrument, whether you're doing biology, clearly nobody here is doing biology, so maybe I won't talk about that.
Who knows?
But
who knows?
That's true. Okay, well, sometimes some experiments have very long lead times, especially if you're doing like animal research, for instance. So it might take you 3 years just to run your experiment and then collect the data to analyze it. So you apply for these positions, and they have sort of a set number of years that they're funded. And usually you negotiate some mix of doing the project that's funded that you're actually getting paid for, and then doing a subset of your own research. And you can negotiate that with the PI at the onset. Maybe it's like 20% your own time, 30% your own time. And then the salary is a little negotiable. It's usually based off of something that we'll talk about later called the NIH pay scale, which is abysmal. It's not great for it's not good for grad students, the pay scale, but postdoc is not significantly better, I would say. And then during this time, you write papers. Maybe you write grants. That depends on the PI, whether you write grants. So you're not required to write grants usually. And then sometimes you advise students, sometimes you teach courses. A lot of this is kind of open to what you want to do and what you negotiate with the PI who's funding you. And then some fields don't have postdocs, like math. I think in math, it's pretty standard to get a PhD and go straight into a teaching position. But in physics, luckily, I think usually you do a postdoc. I don't know about theory. Are there a lot of theory postdocs?
There are definitely theory postdocs. I don't know. The other kind of factor in this is how many postdocs people do. That has changed with time. I mentioned I did 2. I know colleagues now who are doing up to 3 postdoctoral positions, and that's something we could probably talk about in the discussion afterwards. Right.
And that means you may be moving 3 times within 9 years. Yeah. And then there's these prize fellowships. This is the idea that you apply for either an institutional fellowship, so a fellowship at a given institution where you go there to do independent research, or you can apply for these sort of like national or international fellowships where they will fund you to do research at a place, mostly of your choosing. There's usually a rank ordered list, and some of these fellowships only let you take it to a handful of institutions. So these are typically 3 to 5 years. I mean, the vast majority of them, I think, are 3 years. I don't know if I know one that's 5 years. but this funds your independent research. So you have an idea that you pitch and they say they want to fund it. You're not required to do that project necessarily because they're funding you as an independent researcher and your ideas. But I think it's more that you have a good idea. You're able to synthesize a good idea in like, you know, a normal timeline of what you would expect to do in 3 years. And for these, the salary is fixed, but it's usually above the pay scale of NIH. It's usually better than a normal postdoc. And I think even then it like ratchets up every year because they try to take into account cost of living that increases. And you do, you know, many of the same things. You write papers, you write grants, you can advise students. You may or may not teach courses. It's probably something you have to negotiate with the institution that you take it to. But you pay for your own time. So you kind of decide what you want to do with your time. And it's no surprise that these are highly competitive because they give you so much freedom. So it's about a 5 to 10% chance of getting one. But if you don't apply, then you will never get one. So you should definitely apply for these. The format tends to be a little different. I actually can't remember. Do we have a slide where we talk about? Yeah, we do. We talk about all the things that go into these. So yeah, we'll talk about that a little later. It's typically a little different than the other postdoc position that I mentioned. Okay, so this is that NIH pay scale that I talked about. So you can see that the first level is pre-doc. So this is when you're a graduate student. This is what they think a graduate student should make in a year, $26,000. And then once you're a postdoc, a 0 is like your freshly minted PhD. Then this is the pay scale. And you see that it increases a little bit. But depending on where you live, you know, you could either live like a king or a queen, or you could live, you know, in squalor. This is not a great pay scale, but I think it has to take into account the median kind of living conditions in the US. So 26K in lots of places in the country is not terrible. It's just San Diego that it's horrible. In California in general, I imagine this is just not good. So I feel like in astronomy, you rarely get paid this low. I think most people try and factor in like a little extra into their grants. So I haven't seen anyone get paid according to this. I see people get paid a little over this, not a lot, but like a little bit over this. Is that your feeling, Adam? I mean, you've written a lot of grants.
Yeah, I mean, the NIH is National Institute of Health, and so this covers folks like in biology and stuff like that. And it's true that their salaries are quite a bit low. So in STEM fields like physics and math and astronomy, they tend to be a little bit higher, but it also will vary from place to place. So some institutions will try to take into account cost of living factors as well. So this is just a guideline. It's not a fixed salary scale, but it is kind of what most folks base it on.
I think this is the floor though, right? I don't think you can pay less than this.
I know in some fields they definitely pay less than this. So
okay,
yeah,
fair enough. And then they say postdoc 7 or more. I think a lot of institutions cap the number of years you can be designated a postdoc. At UC, I think it's only 7 years, right? Is that?
Like I said, I know folks who are on their third postdoc, which means they're going up to year 7, 8, and 9. So it probably depends on the institution.
Right.
Okay, so
okay, I don't have much more to say.
Yeah, we'll have lots more to say later. So, you know, certainly when you're thinking about, so, you know, salary is one of the considerations that you should definitely be keeping in mind as you're thinking about where to apply, you know, which fellowships and which postdoc positions to apply. There's a lot of other things that's important to consider. And at some level, this is kind of, you know, what you should have been thinking about when you apply for graduate schools, you know, for UCSD, for example. Certainly things like the institutional research fit is probably more important at the postdoc stage. You want to make sure you're going to an institution where there are other folks working on the kind of work that you're doing, whether that's experimental versus theory, whether that's in stellar research versus extragalactic versus cosmology. I do know folks who will go to an institution, say, for example, Carnegie, you know, want to do stellar research, and there's nobody there that does stellar research, and it can be very isolating in those kind of cases. So you do want to kind of look and see, based on what your particular research interests are and what your skill set is, it's good to find institutions that have a good match for that. Because one of the important things as a postdoc is this is a phase of your life where you're starting to develop your network, professional network. And so if you land in a place where you don't really have new contacts to make, it's sometimes hard to kind of grow your career that way. Of course, another important thing is just the climate of the institution. Is this a community that feels welcoming to postdocs? Is this a community that has a strong postdoc sort of integration in the department? I will say that when I went to UCLA, we had, for my first postdoc, we had quite a few other postdocs, but the community wasn't quite strong. And so there were many cases where I felt somewhat isolated from the rest of the department, because in some cases you're kind of seen as a transient member of the community, much more so than as a grad student. So that's something to always consider. And that's hard to know, from the web page. This is where you want to start to talk to folks who are at those institutions when you're thinking about where to apply or where to accept a position. Certainly, the other thing is, if you are doing particularly those soft money positions, is the PI that you're doing soft money a good fit for you? And that could be both in terms of their research, but also their behavior, their demeanor, right? Is this something that you can imagine working with and growing your career over the next few years? And again, this is something that is important to talk to folks who might be working with that person. And then, of course, I think one of the main things, and Chris kind of hinted at this a little bit, is, there are personal considerations about location and quality of life. So if you have a particular constraint to a location, maybe because of family issues or two-body problems, if you want to make sure that you have a good standard of living as you're going into postdoc, that may factor into places that you want to go. Other considerations: if you're an outdoor person, you may not like to live in New York for 3 years. If you are an urban person who likes to go to museums, you may not like to go to Kansas. Or nothing wrong with Kansas, but there's probably not the same kind of museums they have in the big cities. So these are all considerations you should make, because you are committing a few years of your life to that particular place. And of course, there's other constraints, such as we've mentioned, the salary. Are there appropriate healthcare, and particularly childcare benefits? What is the political environment of the region? That may be a factor you want to consider. Taxes is a big thing, particularly when it comes to postdoctoral fellowships. This is kind of a small detail, and maybe we'll cover it back a little bit later, but fellowships in particular require you to report your own taxes, and it's a lot more work than having just a salary from the institution. So there are issues like that. And of course, visa requirements are another factor to figure out if you're a foreign student.
Okay, so things that you will need to prepare for your postdoc job application. CV is paramount. I think on a later slide, we talk about having a short version, a long version. So it's good to have, a CV with everything on it, but then maybe a summary CV that's 1 to 2 pages. Summary of your graduate research. Sometimes this is called past and current research, that I think almost anything you apply for is going to ask for this, because it's a requirement for most prize fellowships, but also for normal postdocs. They want to see how your skill set will benefit the project that they have funding for. And then your plan for postdoctoral research. So, if you're doing a prize fellowship, they want your proposed research. What are you going to do for the next 3 years? I think that many regular postdoc positions also ask about, how you would benefit the project that they have posted. I can't quite remember that from my experience, but I think that is something that they typically ask for. And then recommendation letters. I think 3 is pretty standard for most of the fellowships. So you should probably ask the people you would like to write letters early on if they're willing to do it, just to put it on their radar, and then give them the dates, because it's usually faculty and they're extremely busy. And then a cover letter, which is like a 1-page letter that kind of gives a summary. This is usually the first thing that they read. I think a lot of fellowships don't require this, but almost all postdoc positions require this. And it's good to get in the habit of doing this. Certainly industry positions, this is optional, But as many of you may have found, when things say optional, many times that means you should do it, because that sets you kind of aside from the people who are too lazy to do it. And then other things that are probably useful to have, you should have a web page that kind of summarizes your research, has links to lots of these things like your CV, and maybe something that humanizes you outside of your field, you know, whether it's photography, something with your interest. That's always good to show that you're a multi-dimensional person. And then you should try and give talks. It's called doing the talk tour. And that's usually, I mean, the earlier you do it, the better, because then more people know your research, know you, and they can associate you with it. So I would say no later than like the year before you are graduating that you want to start trying to give talks. And we have resources for that. I can't remember if I posted up the talk link, but I can do that later. And social media, and this is like a double-edged sword for me, but it, you know, it doesn't hurt maybe if you have Twitter, Facebook, things like that, where you can post your papers, your, you know, science, not necessarily your independent belief. That's like different. You can do that. You can do whatever you want on social media, but if we're talking about just for the postdoc, it's always safe to stay with your science, I would say.
Yeah, and again, social media is not something that's universal, and it really is a professional visibility that you use this for. So you know, I have a professional Twitter account that I mostly just use for advertising papers and stuff like that. Same thing, you know, with your Facebook page. You know, folks may be looking at your Facebook page, so you may want to take a moment to make sure that it's as professional as possible. People do kind of do social media searches in some cases when they're trying to decide between candidates, and that's true both in academia and in industry. So just keep that in mind as you're starting to think about the next steps. So in terms of CV, hopefully some of you have started to think about this or put this together, but this is definitely, you know, kind of this is the resume equivalent for academia. This is something that you're going to be updating for the rest of your life. And it's good to start putting together the pieces of this, particularly for this phase. And as Chris mentioned, you know, there's kind of a couple formats for CVs out there. There's lots of templates. And so you just, you know, a good idea is kind of maybe look around some of your faculty, mentors, maybe peers, and see if there's a nice CV. And I'll show you a couple examples that Chris and I have for ours. But the elements of that CV, you know, there's kind of basic, you know, name and contact information just right off the top, what your current position is, what your research interests are, you know, kind of what your education, what degrees you've earned, or what schools you're attending right now. And then maybe a section on awards or honors if you have that. The key thing that folks, and particularly in academia, are going to be looking at are the publications and the second degree, kind of your presentations or your sort of speaking activity. So when you get your publications, a good rule is to, if you have first author papers, is to set those off at the top. Because often, particularly at this stage, folks who are looking for new postdocs are looking for folks who have, you know, led research activities. Now, this, of course, is field dependent. There are many fields where grad students are not first authors. Perhaps the standard is to just list the authors in alphabetical order. Perhaps the standard is to put the first author, primary author at the end. And so, of course, this will vary with field, but you want to make sure you highlight at least those papers where you are the primary author. Even if the field doesn't indicate that that's your first or where you are in the list. You can include non-peer-reviewed articles at the end, and you can also even include articles in preparation, which is usually good at this stage because you're probably finishing up quite a lot of your papers now as you're finishing up your thesis. So advertising that those are coming out is also a good way to kind of beef up your resume. In terms of presentations, these are just the, where you've given particularly talks. Those are often the most important, but also include things like poster presentations. And you may want to set off or somehow signify those in which you've been invited to talk. And that includes if you've been asked to give a talk at the University of Idaho or something like that. You want to kind of set off those invited talks because that kind of conveys the sort of interest that other folks have in you, and that helps with your profile when you're applying. You can also include specific skills and training. This is particularly important for those of you who are doing lab or computational work. Any teaching experience you might have, and that includes TAing and also tutoring. If you want, you can add other outreach and community activities. You don't want to, at the point where you're starting to get like, I'm also interested in weightlifting and stuff like that, that's probably not appropriate for the academic CV. But if you feel that that's an important component of sharing who you are, you can add that as well. And then you should end with the names of your primary references. Because in some cases, some postdoc positions at this point are now just asking for the names of references and not necessarily asking you to submit letters with your application, which frankly is fantastic because it saves everyone a lot of time. But that's kind of the structure for a very long CV. Now, you should also have available, because often in some cases, the CVs might have a page limit. So, particularly as you go further on in your career, this structure could end up with, dozens of pages. And so you want to make sure you have handy a short CV as well. This is a image that's probably way too small for most of you to see. And we'll share around these slides, by the way, with an email later on. But this is my one-page CV, right? I've been an astronomer now for 25 years or so, and I can still fit all the important stuff just on one page. It just sort of hits kind of the key positions I've had, any sort of relevant honors, and then the very specific publications that I want to highlight as the kind of core aspects of my work. And then, Chris, you got yours?
Yeah, mine's not as full as yours, but you've been doing this a lot longer than I have. So I also don't use, I think maybe when you get to your position, you use this even more. But in my position, I find I just give people the full thing more often than the one page. I just kind of have a one-page-ish summary on my webpage, but not like I don't use the formal one too often, I would say.
Yeah, and as you go forward, as you're applying for things like grants and other fellowships, again, they might ask for a 1 or 2 page CV. So it's just useful to have that handy, and it's something that people who are just kind of browsing your website might want to look at as well. Okay, so then in terms of the timeline, so one of the reasons we wanted to have this, and actually Christian and Roman wanted us to have this at this time, is that we are actually at the start of the cycle for jobs. You might think, well, this is not until the fall, so I have some time. But really, this is the point where you want to start building up and doing the groundwork for what positions you're applying for, and in particular, making sure you're contacting folks who are writing letters for you. And so somewhere around June or August, and we're, it's actually roughly kind of 11 months or a year before you graduate. So we're assuming kind of these are folks who are graduating next summer. Now you really want to start to put this stuff together. And that's thinking about what jobs you want to apply for, who is writing your letters, and organizing all of those deadlines, what submission materials are required for each of them, and getting this all down in sort of a nice spreadsheet. And Dino was kind enough to allow us to share his spreadsheet for this last cycle of job applications. And you can see he's applied for 28 jobs in that last cycle. So that's one thing to keep in mind, is that this is not usually a one job application, one job hire. It's important to kind of apply for several of them. And you can see that he's organized when the letter of recommendations are due, how many letters, I can scroll here, how many letters are required. Sorry, my computer's a little slow. Who's actually submitted their letters, when is Dino's deadline for submitting material, right? So you can sort this by the dates, what's actually required for each of those, right? So you can organize this any way you want, also sort of links for where things get submitted. But it's a good idea to kind of start this, figuring out what your sort of organizational process is now. This is, I should say, is particularly helpful for your letter writers if you could share this with them so that they know what the deadlines are for those letters, because we are the ones that are often sending letters in directly. You will not be collecting our letters to submit for most all of these postdocs. We will be submitting them in ourselves. So the more organized you are, the more likely we will be organized, and the more likely all this material will get in on the right time. And that's important because some of these applications are actually coming in relatively early. So the submission deadlines can be as early as October. I think the NSF GRFP, sorry, not GRFP, the postdoctoral fellowship program is early October. Is that right?
I think it's like mid-October, mid to late now. They pushed it back a little.
Okay. So some of these, some of these applications are coming up early in our fall term. And so the earlier you can get yourself organized and particularly get your letter writers organized, the more likely you'll make all those deadlines. The other thing to do to start thinking about this summer is also to schedule your talks. So as Chris mentioned, that's one thing that's in terms of getting visibility. And I think maybe we'll talk a little bit about how to do that maybe at the end. But these could be the journal clubs that we have at CAS. These could be just reaching out through your collaboration networks and seeing if you can give a talk at those folks' institutions. Now is the time, because I can tell you, because I'm organizing the CAS seminar this term with George, we are now soliciting names for those talks. So now is a good time to start reaching out to folks. As mentioned, the submission deadlines are kind of in the fall from October to December, and then you'll start to get results in January and March. And that's, in some cases that could be it. Great, you've got, an application, you got a hit, or you've got, a couple hits, so you make a decision. But that could also be the time, if you didn't get anything accepted, to think about what is the sort of backup plan and what are the next rounds of applications. Because particularly when we start to move out of academia, those job cycles are very different than we have in US academia. And same thing, Europe has a different job cycle as well. Over to you, Chris.
Sorry. One last thing I want to add to what Adam was saying is there's a spreadsheet that's going around in the community that has points of contact for talks at different institutions. And I can add that link here, but we can also share it around more broadly. I just got to dig it up from my email.
Okay.
Yeah. So where do you find jobs? So probably the best place to start is the AAS job register. They post lots of jobs. They post fellowships. They post, individual postdoctoral positions that people have. And I think they also have a lot of international positions here. Yep, there we go. Wales, Victoria. So this is a good place to first start. You can find kind of the meat and potatoes of what the job entails, so you can see if a job is a good fit for you. I would say when you're making that list, put them in some order of jobs that you really like or you think you're very well suited for at the top. And then, things that you think are kind of fringe or places that you might not be that interested in living, put those down below. Like, this is the next part of your life. So you should have a rank ordered choice to that decision, I think. The next link we had up there was the ES job director. I don't know anything about this, so you'd have to click on that link. I guess is all European jobs?
Yeah, it's the European equivalent.
Okay. Although I imagine some of these jobs end up in the AAS job register as well. But maybe if you're just looking to move internationally, this is a good place to go. And that's just Europe. That's not but I mean, is there an equivalent for South America or Asia?
I don't know. There probably is one for Asia, but I don't know what it is. So if we find out, we'll add it to the slides.
Okay, sounds good. APS Job Center, I imagine this is more physics focused versus astrophysics focused. NASA careers, I guess those are NASA specific jobs. So if you want to work at NASA or at a NASA center,
yeah, and
early careers astronomy.
If you're interested in NASA, so there's a NASA postdoctoral program as well. But a lot of the, if you're working on James Webb or you're working on TESS or some NASA mission, there's actually a lot more jobs in the NASA careers page than there are listed in the AAS register. So if NASA's particular direction you want to head in, that's a good place to also look at.
Early career astronomers and astrophysicists Facebook group. I am not part of this group, so I do not know what goes on here, but hopefully it's just people posting jobs when they come up.
It's both job postings, but also just general career advice and discussion about what it's like to be an early career astronomer. So that's a good, if you're into Facebook and you want to join it, that's a good place to get some discussion.
Hopefully it's invite only so that it requires, it has a little bit of filtering.
Yeah, I can't get in.
Astro better rumor mill. I would only suggest this at the beginning of the job season, just to see. I think a lot of this is aggregated from other places. You know, I don't know how much more this has to offer during, as opposed to like the AAS job register or the APS job center. It's certainly more astro focused, so you're only going to find astro jobs here. But people post updates, so you don't want to go down this rabbit hole for your mental health after you've applied. Just wait like everyone else, and do, you know, keep your head down, do your own research, your own stuff. Don't worry about the job until you start hearing back. And then if you want a non-academic job, there's lots of aggregators for this. I put a bunch of the websites down: Indeed, Dice, TripleByte, AngelList, GitHub, Hire, LinkedIn. Most of these sites allow you to apply directly to the job through the site, but my suggestion would be figure out the jobs you want to apply to and go to the actual company website and apply for the job there, because the format is usually a little bit different. It helps. I think you have a better odd of getting through the first filter of just the machine, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But yeah, you know, just applying for 1,000 jobs through Indeed, your hit rate is going to be abysmal. So you're going to have much better odds of going straight to the website. And use your network. If you have friends who have made the jump from academia into industry, or if you just know people in industry, that's usually a good way to at least front load an interview, like to ensure that you get at least a face-to-face time with somebody who has some sort of hiring power. And once you're in industry, it's a little easier to make the jump around. Because usually if you're coming from academia, you don't have a lot of quote unquote, you know, job experience, at least in industry job experience. So there's always a risk that companies take for that first PhD that they hire. So the sooner you get your foot in the door, the better your odds are for moving around.
Yeah, I think, and then industry, we're going to industry, so you're going to keep on, Chris.
Yeah. Okay, so the hard number, and this is kind of out of date because this is what we used to tell people when I was a grad student, but it's 1 out of 10 PhDs go on to a faculty job. So, you know, those odds are against everyone. The odds are not forever in your favor. But honestly, academia also is something a lot of people decide they don't want to do, at least faculty positions, once they're a grad student, because you see all the things that are required and you decide, you know, this is a lot. And we don't want to do this. But industry is a great place for PhDs because, as Adam mentioned, it's got a very low unemployment rate for physics PhDs. It's got a much higher starting pay. I don't think I put a slide with the pay, but there's a couple of slides. Maybe it is in there later. Okay. Yeah, there you go. Well, we can talk about it later, but it pays very well in industry because Google, Facebook, Apple, you know, all these companies, they have lots and lots and lots of money that they're getting from you every single day. Even right now, as we're talking, they're making money off of you. But they have all this data and they want to put those skills that you've acquired to good use, because that's what you do as a PhD. You learn how to analyze data, and they have lots of it that needs to be analyzed. So this is a good time to start making connections with your grad student network, because a lot of students that you know are going to end up in industry. So this is a good way to make that jump when you finish your PhD, if you want to. I know lots of people who did that. And I think another important thing that people don't do in grad school is reassessing your goals, like on a timely basis. And if you know your third year that you don't want to stay in academia, then there's steps that you can take to ensure that you're going to have a job at the end, and, you know, preferably in a company that you want to work for. So I think it's important to reassess: are you doing the things that you need to do? Are you getting the skills that they value in the industry, or specifically in the industry that you want to go into every year? And then I talk about compensation again for some reason. Yes, it's better. The biggest difference is that you work on projects that are defined for you rather than you working on projects that you define yourself. So, you know, it's a little bit like a postdoc in that sense, except that in a postdoc, you may get some time to work on your own stuff as well. Yeah. Academic job availability.
Yeah, I think
I guess this is the same thing.
Yeah.
What is it, 2011? I mean, these are so old. They don't have anything new, I guess. I haven't seen anything in a long time.
Yeah, well, I mean, you can just see that, you know, this is the bottom dash line is the kind of the year by year, how many faculty positions are available, and the dash blue line is the PhDs awarded. And you can see that's just gone up over the past, you know, 30, 40 years, whereas the faculty positions have stayed basically flat. So the problem just gets worse and worse over time. I think that's the takeaway of this plot.
Yeah.
So, you know, the other thing about industry is that you can really expand out and maybe sort of jump into an area that you may have developed interest in as part of your thesis. And so when we look at, for example, and again, this is based on an AIP Statistical Research Center report, when we look at those folks who go into potentially permanent positions, so again, government or industry jobs, fully 2/3 of them are doing work outside of astrophysics. And so the majority is what you'd expect: engineering, computer software, data science has increasingly become a large fraction of that. Other STEM work, so that covers almost a half of that group. And so a significant fraction of folks who come out with a physics PhD or an astro PhD don't necessarily do physics or astro in industry, but they are using the skills that they've learned in the process of doing their thesis work. I know we've had several graduates from CAS go on to work at some of the genetic companies and biotech companies in the area. Clearly not doing astronomy, but of course using some of that data science skills and data analysis skills that they learned as part of their thesis. And then we'll go back to compensation, right? So that is also, as we mentioned, maybe a factor to consider, particularly if you've got a family to consider for your pay. This is again, same study, recent study from AIP, showing the sort of average and range of salaries. And you can see it's a very big range, so keep that in mind. But the kind of range of salaries for private sector and university and for college potentially permanent positions, these are mostly faculty or research scientist positions. These are mostly in industry, and these are actually all industry. It's private sector. You can see it's about almost a factor of 2 increase in compensation. For postdocs, one interesting fact to note is that government postdocs actually make a little bit more than university postdocs on average. That's partly set by the salary scales that are mandated by the federal government. The flip side of that is that the growth rate of salaries in the federal government is much slower, in fact, capped off at some point. And so that's something to think about for a long-term career, maybe not so much for postdoc. And then all of these are higher than typically the sort of temporary positions you get as maybe an adjunct instructor or whatnot. But this is certainly something to consider when you're thinking about which direction to go, that there is a impact on the salary scale, and that may be something that's important for you.
Okay, so if you want to apply for a non-academic job, what you need to put together is slightly different. You need a resume. You don't need a CV. Forget CV, forget anything you know about a CV. A resume is a completely different beast. It has some of the same information, but the organization of it should be different. So jobs don't necessarily care where you got your degrees from. They want to know what skills you have. So that's what you want to highlight. You want to highlight the projects you've worked on and the skills, the deliverables that you did for that project or gained for that project. And if you're applying for jobs, you also want to integrate as many of the keywords in the job posting into your resume. So that gets you through the first filter, where they try and narrow the list of applicants down to a small subset of people who have the prerequisite skills that they're asking for. Recommendation letters, this is really give or take. I've seen jobs that ask for letters, but I've also seen lots of jobs that don't ask for letters. I think it just depends on where you're applying, what the position is. So you need to figure that out in the application process. these are a little different than what we would typically ask a professor to write, because sometimes they can write a letter for an academic job and use kind of that same letter for lots of different positions that you're going to apply for. But I feel like most of the time that a job is asking for things, there's like a website and they have their own questions that they're asking. So I feel like it's a little bit more work for the people you ask to do this, but they're still willing to do it. You just got to ask them early on in the process. And then a cover letter, which is almost always optional usually, but highly suggested. It's the summary of, you know, what you, of a lot of the stuff in your resume, of like the projects you've worked on, the skills that you have, why you would be a good fit for the job, what do you bring, but also what would you like to gain from the job. This is a give and take, where they want you to grow as well. They want to know, you know, what you're gonna get better at from this job, what you think you're gonna gain. And a website, you know, maybe like, at least for what I saw when I was hiring, maybe like 20% of applicants had their own website, but it did set them apart. Part of this is setting yourself apart from the rest of the pack, so that you kind of show that you're a unique individual for the position. You don't want to be, you know, kind of in the one sigma standard deviation. You definitely want to set yourself apart from all the other applicants however you can. And in the resume, that's one thing you can do. You can break away from like the black and white, just like line by line, and kind of have something unique for your own person. LinkedIn is useful. Lots of people look at your LinkedIn page when you're applying for an industry position. GitHub page can be useful because you can post your projects there, especially if you've done kind of data science-y projects that are related to the position you're applying for. I mean, well, I guess it doesn't have to be data science then, but projects related to the position you're applying for. And if it is data science, then having a Kaggle profile is useful, because Kaggle is a website where lots of people post data science-y problems, and the community kind of comes together to show different strategies for how they would approach these problems. So at least what I've seen from data science jobs is that people who have attempted some of those, it's a good metric for their skills when you're applying for a job.
And one comment on the resume, I think for industry jobs is pretty centrally important, particularly when you work with these aggregators like Indeed and stuff like that. And there's a lot of dark arts in resume, you know, getting past the filter. That's kind of like the main goal. You know, I think, Chris, you mentioned that, you know, the school may not matter, but there are some jobs where they are looking for, like, did you go to an Ivy League? This is like banker jobs, right? Mm. So, you know, there are a few, so certainly making sure the keywords are in there is important. There's a few dark art things like, you know, listing every Ivy League in white text and 1-point font along the bottom. People have done that. So just keep in mind that there's kind of a war of attrition with the filters, and that's if you want to look more into that, you can Google that.
Yeah, and this is just an example of one that I put. It's pretty old now, but you can see that it's not. I tried to go for not boring, and that, you know, I didn't get 100% hit rate with this CV, but I got a decent hit rate, you know, like 15-20%. So that's pretty good when you're applying for jobs, I feel.
Did you really live on Data Science Road in Beverly Hills, California?
I did not, unfortunately. I always wanted to, though. And my phone number is not 8675309, but I always hoped it would be.
Yeah. Okay, so that was it for our kind of formal presentation. So we wanted to save 10 minutes here to just answer any questions that folks have. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, so you can feel free to ask anything.